So we now move to part two, how abnormal behavior is explained. And if part one was about defining abnormality and seeing where the field came from, oops, alarm, right? Okay, so again, if part one was about defining abnormality and seeing where the field of psychology came from, part two is about a deeper question. Why does psychological disorder happen in the first place? And this is where many students want one neat answer. They ask, so what really causes mental disorder? Biology, trauma, thinking patterns, is it family or society? The honest answer is it depends. And usually, it is not just one thing. Hindi ito one cause, one effect na parang simpleng math problem. For example, ang dalawang tao pwedeng makadevelop ng depression but not for the same reasons because one may have a strong family history or chronic negative thinking and a recent breakup. The other one could have trauma or isolation, no? Isolation cases, issues, financial stress, no emotional support. So if you can see, we have the same diagnosis na pareho silang depressed pero different yung pathway, no? Different yung pinanggalingan. So in this part, we study the major models of explanation, not because one of them is the absolute winner, but because each one gives us an important piece of the picture. Okay, so let's start our discussion. The biological beliefs and tradition. So again, from supernatural, punta tayo ngayon sa biological tradition, no? Sa biological tradition, it suggests that abnormal behavior can come from physical causes such as genetics, brain dysfunction, neurotransmitter imbalance, hormones or nervous system irregularities. In short, it says that to understand some forms of psychological disorder, we also need to look at the body and the brain, yung connection ng ating katawan sa ating utak. This tradition was a major shift away, kita nyo naman, from supernatural thinking because it treated mental disturbance as something that could be studied in natural and medical terms. Hindi demonyo agad, no? And this is a really, really good progress. Today, of course, we claim that biological perspective is still very influential, but not enough, all right? How does it become influential? For example, in bipolar disorder, okay, it has been noted that it has a genetic component. Schizophrenia has long been studied in relation to how the brain develops and dopamine pathways. Ganun din sa panic symptoms, it can involve very real physiological arousal, rapid heartbeat, sweating, dizziness, which can be misinterpreted by the person as a sign that they are dying or losing control. But here is the important caution. Biological does not mean purely biological. It does not mean fixed, hopeless, or chemical imbalance lang yan. Biology matters, yes, just like what we've mentioned, but it interacts with environment. Also with stress, with the way you learn, okay, your sleep, whatever trauma you're holding on to, and your relationship. So this perspective is powerful, yes, and a big jump from supernatural, but incomplete on its own. So the next tradition is the psychological tradition that focuses on the mind, emotion, your learning, your experience, and inner processes. So instead of asking only what is happening in the brain or body, it also asks what is happening in the person's thoughts. Ano nangyayari sa pag-iisip ba ng isang tao? Or dun sa kanyang emotional world, no? And then your developmental history also, we also look at that, and different coping patterns. And this tradition includes different schools of thought, which we will be talking about shortly. Psychodynamic, no? There's behavioral, there's cognitive and humanistic. And again, they do not all agree with each other, but they share one important idea. Psychological suffering is not just random, okay? And it often makes sense when viewed in relation to learning history, all right? Unresolved conflict, distorted thinking, painful experience, or blocked emotional needs. For example, someone with social anxiety may not just be mahiyain, or they may be anticipating humiliation, rejection, or embarrassment every time they enter a social situation. Someone with depression may not just be negativo or negative thinker, no, because they may be trapped in patterns of hopelessness, self-criticism, and emotional exhaustion that have become hard to interrupt. So the psychological tradition helps us understand the inner logic of suffering. Ngayon, punta tayo sa isa sa mga important chapters ng history of abnormal psychology is the movement from moral treatment to modern care. Moral treatment emphasized that people with mental disorders should be treated with dignity, compassion, rest, structure, and humane care rather than fear, punishment, or neglect katulad ng spiritual tradition. At the time, okay, this was a major step forward. Kasi imagine mo from being treated like a threat or a moral failure na makasalanan ka lang kasi, alright? Or, hindi ka lang masyadong nagsisimba. Okay? Dapat mag-reflect ka sa mga ginagawa mo sa buhay, alright? Now, people are finally being treated like human beings. Okay? It could be bare minimum, yes, but historically, malaking bagay na rin. However, moral treatment did not solve everything. Over time, many reforms weakened again because of overcrowding. Sa dami ng cases, then the system was not able to handle it. So the system is poor, no? Poor systems and lack of funding and institutional problems. Even now that the government has passed law here in the Philippines, alam natin na kulang pa rin tayo sa funding and ang dami pa rin institutional problems, no, na nangyayari, not just in the workplace, no, even in educational institutions is very prevalent. So while the move toward humane care was important, okay, the reality remained complicated. So even today, as I've mentioned, we still deal with versions of the same issue. We say mental health matters, but access is uneven. We encourage people to seek help, but services are expensive. We talk about compassion, but again, stigma is still so strong. And there's still a lot of judgment surrounding mental health challenges. So modern care has improved a lot, alright? And we are very, very hopeful. Pero hindi pa tayo tapos, alright? Malayo pa ang ating tatakbuhin. Now, let's look at the present approach, no? An integrative approach. Today, abnormal psychology generally takes an integrative approach. This means we no longer assume that one explanation is enough. Instead, we recognize that biological factors, psychological processes, social experiences, development, and culture often interact. Think of it this way. A person may have a biological vulnerability. Tapos naka-experience pa siya ng chronic stress. Then, na-develop yung kanyang thinking patterns. Tapos wala pa siyang suporta sa paligid niya. Tapos wala ding siyang coping mechanism na healthy. And that is already several levels interacting. Hindi siya isang dahilan lang. It is a system, no? And this is why modern psychology tends to move away from simplistic explanations like genetics lang yan, or mindset lang, or may problema lang yan sa pamilya, because it's usually more complex than that. The integrative approach is strong because it reflects real life better. Human beings are multi-layered, and so is psychopathology. So what are the current approaches in psychopathology, right? So the current approaches in psychopathology reflect that integrative mindset, no? Sama-sama. Instead of asking which one model is the only correct one, modern abnormal psychology asks how different levels of explanation fit together, just like what we have mentioned. And these approaches, again, include biological, psychological, behavioral, cognitive, psychodynamic, humanistic, sociocultural, and developmental perspectives, right? And some emphasize brain and body processes, pero yung iba naman, focus niya thought and patterns and learning. Others focus on relationship, context, identity, or social systems. And the key point is this: different models highlight different truths. Parang group project na may iba-ibang ambag, except ideally, in this case, everyone is actually contributing. Each perspective helps us see something that another perspective might miss. So the goal is not model loyalty, the goal is better understanding. All right? So let's talk about the biological approach first, which explains that psychopathology is explained by, in terms of genetics, nervous system functioning, brain structure, brain chemistry, hormones, and other physiological processes. Okay, it asks how physical systems may contribute to psychological symptoms. For example, if someone has panic symptoms, the biological approach might look at autonomic nervous system arousal. If someone has depression, it may examine sleep regulation, neurochemistry, a very interesting subject as well, or perhaps family history. If someone has schizophrenia, it may explore brain development, dopamine pathways, and genetic risk. This approach is very valuable because it reminds us that the mind is not floating outside the body. Okay? But then again, we have to avoid reductionism. Hindi porket may biology involved, solved na ang case. Biology may, how do you put it, load the gun, but environment, stress experience, they often help pull the trigger. So the biological approach is important, yes, but it works best in conversation with the other approaches. Like this one, the psychological approach. Again, psychological approach focuses on internal processes such as emotion, thought, memory, coping, personality, and personal meaning. It asks how people interpret experience, regulate feelings, respond to stress, and make sense of themselves and the world. This matters because two people can go through similar events, just like what I've mentioned, right? But the outcome may be very different. One may develop resilience while another may develop severe anxiety or depression. And bakit nangyayari yan? Because experience alone is not the whole story. The person's interpretation, coping style, history, and emotional resources also matter. So if one student fails an exam and thinks that was bad, but I can recover, and another thinks I am a failure and this proves I'm not good enough, if you can see, same event, but we have very different psychological processing. So the psychological approach helps us understand the inner machinery of distress, but again, by itself is not enough, all right? Next would be the behavioral perspective. The behavioral perspective explains abnormal behavior through learning. It looks at how behavior is acquired and maintained through conditioning, reinforcement, punishment, avoidance, right? And these are very, very important elements, okay, that we have to look at. For example, a student once embarrasses themselves during a class presentation. After that, they start avoiding public speaking. The avoidance reduces anxiety in the short term, so the behavior gets reinforced. The person feels relief, so they keep avoiding. Over time, the fear grows stronger, not weaker, and that is a classic behavioral logic. Short-term relief, long-term maintenance. So what does it mean? This perspective is especially useful for understanding phobias, compulsions, safety behaviors, and other patterns where behavior gets shaped by consequences. It is also a good reminder that people do not keep doing things for no reason. Kahit maladaptive ang behavior, usually may short-term payoff yan. Okay, and let's go to the cognitive perspective. In cognitive perspective, we focus on how people think, how they interpret events, explain experience, judge themselves, and anticipate the future. So here we emphasize automatic thoughts, cognitive distortions, dysfunctional assumptions, and maladaptive schemas. For example, a student who gets one low grade might think, I'm a failure, another might think, I need to improve, but one score does not define me. So you see, same event, different interpretation, different emotional outcome. And this perspective is very helpful in understanding depression, anxiety, trauma related conditions, and even some aspects of personality dysfunction. Here, it reminds us that thoughts are not harmless background noise, right? They can shape emotions, decisions, attention, and behavior. Minsan, yung iniisip natin tungkol sa nangyayari is more damaging than the event itself. Now, we have another perspective, the psychodynamic perspective. The psychodynamic perspective traces abnormal behavior to unconscious conflict, no? Early relationships, unresolved emotional experiences, and defense mechanisms. It asks what deeper emotional themes may be operating underneath the surface. For example, a person may react intensely to criticism, not just because of the criticism itself, but because it activates old feelings of inadequacy, rejection, or shame from earlier relationships. In psychodynamic terms, current behavior may carry the emotional weight of older experiences. Now, some students hear psychodynamic and immediately think, yes, everything is childhood, hidden feelings, diba? That's medyo exaggerated, no? But the perspective remains useful because it highlights emotional depth, relationship patterns, and the fact that not all motives are fully conscious. Sometimes people do not fully understand why they keep repeating the same painful pattern. Okay, next, the humanistic perspective. In the humanistic perspective, okay, we focus on subjective experience, self-concept, authenticity, growth, and the conditions that support psychological well-being. Instead of asking only what is wrong with the person, it also asks what has become blocked, wounded, or disconnected. From this view, distress may happen when a person becomes alienated from their values, needs, identity, or sense of meaning. Halimbawa, someone may look fine on paper, good grades, decent image, functioning outside, no? But inside they feel empty, disconnected, or trapped in a life that no longer feels like their own. Sounds like a telenovela, di ba? But hindi lahat ng ganitong cases ay may diagnosis agad. Humanistic psychology helps us take that experience seriously, however. And this perspective is especially strong in reminding us that people are more than symptoms. A person is not just a case file, not just a diagnosis, and definitely not just a one bad semester. Okay, we look at the whole person. Okay, that's why it's called the humanistic perspective. Next is the sociocultural perspective. Okay, it emphasizes that abnormal behavior does not happen in a vacuum. It happens within families, communities, institutions, economies, cultures, and systems of power. This means we have to pay attention to factors like, sorry about that, factors like poverty, discrimination, family conflict, social exclusion, gender expectations, cultural norms, and chronic stress. So, for example, if a person is constantly anxious, we should not only ask about their personality, we should also ask, ano bang uring mundo meron silang ginagalawan? Baka naman ang environment talaga ang sobrang nakaka-pressure. This perspective matters because sometimes we individualize what is actually systemic. In other words, minsan ang tanong is not only what is wrong with the person, but also what has this person been living through? And that question changes everything. What has this person been living through, right? So that is socio-cultural perspective. And that will lead us to the developmental perspective naman. It looks at how psychopathology unfolds across the whole lifespan. It emphasizes that the timing of experience matters. What happens in childhood, adolescence, or early adulthood can shape later vulnerability, resilience, and symptom expression. For example, difficulty concentrating in one person may be long-standing and neurodevelopmental. In another, it may start only after trauma, burnout, or sleep deprivation. Again, we have similar symptoms here, but we have different developmental story. And this perspective is important because abnormal behavior is not frozen. It changes over time. Nagbabago ito habang nagbabago ang panahon. Symptoms may appear differently depending on age, role, context, and developmental stage. So when we assess someone, we should not only ask what is happening now, we should also know how to ask how did this pattern develop across the lifespan. Okay. And now we have the biopsychosocial social model that brings together biological, psychological, cultural, and social influences into one framework. It says that mental disorder usually develops through the interaction of multiple systems, not one isolated cause. So, for example, a student may have a genetic vulnerability to anxiety, then grow up in a highly critical environment, then develop perfectionistic thinking, then enter a stressful college setting with little sleep and little support. That is already biological, psychological, and social factors interacting. Hindi siya one-note explanation. This model is useful because it reflects reality better. It reminds us that people are complex, and honestly, if anyone tries to explain all psychopathology using only one factor, magiging suspicious ka na dapat because human beings are too layered for one cause theories. Again, hindi natin sila pinag-aaway-away. Alright, these approaches, alright, these models, we combine them to understand human behavior and human psyche better. And now let's go to the predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, and protective factors. One practical way to apply the integrative view is through the 4Ps: predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, and protective factors. Alright? Predisposing factors are the vulnerabilities that increase risk, like genetics, no? Early trauma, temperament, or long-standing beliefs. Yan yung mga predisposing factors. Precipitating factors naman yung mga nagtitrigger at ng problema. Halimbawa ay breakup, no? Academic failure, sudden loss of a loved one, or grief. No? Those are precipitating factors. Perpetuating factors are the things that keep the problem going. Could be avoidance, substance abuse, poor sleep, negative thinking, or toxic environments. And last P, protective factors. Okay, the things that help recovery, like support, coping skills, therapy, all right, faith is important, okay, insight, or healthy routines. And this framework is very useful because it helps us move from general theory into actual case understanding. Okay, parang instead of asking only what disorder is this, we also ask why this problem in this person at this time and what keeps it going. And that is a much more clinical question. By the way, the shield of Captain America is the protective factor. Okay? I don't know how you're going to put an analogy to that. All right? So again, when we do case formulation, we ask why this problem in this person at this time and what keeps it going. Okay, that is a much cleaner clinical question. All right? So that completes part 2. Okay, stay tuned for part 3 where we will talk about diagnosis and assessment. Thank you so much for